Hi, Josh. This is Sharon Mistretta, and I chose to answer your question regarding your new Scratch program using Screencast-O-Matic. It's easier for me to talk to you about some enhancements or modifications to your program. So what I want to do, and by the way, I'm also thrilled that you're working with the math teacher on this, as you indicated in your email to me. STEM is an integrated field of study, and I think that schools perhaps swim lane and silo the different disciplines, which is the way that schools have been structured since the beginning of schools. But what is best to do is for you as a science teacher and the math teacher to collaborate on this, because that is when the students get the most out of the work that they're doing. So what I want to do is I want to begin by just talking to you a little bit about the difference between coding and programming. They are there's different connotations in real world context. So if your students are heading to the workplace, the nuances that I want to talk to you about are important in the workplace. So the term coding is transforming actions into a symbolic language. So for example, if I am going to use a variable called gender, I can code that variable to be 1 equals male and 2 equals female, and then programming is taking that symbolic language with the variable gender and acting upon it with logic in the program. So they would do one thing for gender as coded in one way and something very different in another way. So that is the coding, is the taking that variable and making different values so that we can act upon it. But those values are decided upon by the programmer and ultimately in the workplace by the team, so that they are evaluating that variable in a certain way. So that's coding. Programming is taking that symbolic language and then doing something with the value of that variable. So I argue that if your student is a job applicant and they walked into an interview and said that they know how to code, the interviewer might say to them, okay, but can you program? So that is the difference, and this is something that I will be covering in our next live session, but I did want to talk to you about that briefly. So one suggestion, I think that you're really on the great trajectory here regarding your program, but one thing that I would suggest is in looking at the sprites, you're on the right track that you coded a scene change, but what I'm going to suggest to you is rather than changing and incrementing your variable by 1, I believe that you should set your variable when you get to when you change the scene. So rather than increment the variable, set the variable when you have a keystroke perhaps that your user has used, maybe by a up arrow or left or right arrow. And the reason is because if you increment that variable, you are taking an assumption, making an assumption that the program flow is going to be exactly what you had expected it to be. What I teach my students that are doing iOS app writing or Android app writing is that they should program and code the application such that if a mom or a dad hands their mobile device to a toddler, and that toddler is going to click on whatever they want to, not necessarily in the order that you thought. So by changing the scene change increment by 1, you're not accounting for the event that a user is clicking something you hadn't expected to click in a certain sequence. You're going by the sequence that is in your thought process. You have to go by the sequence that is in their potential thought process. So if you have your scenes, I would strongly suggest that you set a variable instead of changing a variable when you arrive at a particular scene with a particular backdrop, and then evaluate that to see if your variable is a certain number It can be 1, 2, 3, etc., but not the sequence of 1, 2, and 3. You have to discover where you are with that variable and what backdrop is up, what sprites are on the screen, and act upon that based on what that scene is. Because if they're tapping a key, a space bar, an up arrow, and you expect them to do that in a certain scene, they won't. And ultimately what will happen is if they press that key, it will invoke something entirely unexpected that didn't go with what you thought was the flow of the program. So I'd strongly suggest that you, instead of incrementing and adding, set that variable when you know you're in a certain backdrop and a certain sprite that has to do something, so that your program will act upon it in a consistent way. So I hope that helps. And what I'd like you to do is, as you make progress, send me the next iteration of your program so that I can just weigh in on what you're doing. This looks like a fantastic program, and I wish you and the math teacher a lot of great programming experience together, and for your students as well.